Let's begin with a word of prayer, silent word of prayer. Amen. Okay. I'm going to begin with sharing I'm going to use the whiteboard, but I'm going to start with my slideshow. And just let me know if you can't see it. Okay, so the study we're going to look at today is from an article written by Jared A. Goldstein, and it's called Unfit for the Constitution, Nativism and the Constitution from the Founding Fathers to Donald Trump. Okay, so in the title itself, it shows us that we are going to be walking through history right up to our generation. I'm going to kind of start with a quick summary. So how many of you first remember the executive order on travel that was issued by President Donald Trump in January of 2017? Anyone?
Was it the one to ban the Muslims from entering the country?
Yeah. So could you go ahead and read this this section for us on the...
It says, this executive order identified the foreigners who should be barred from entry as those who bear hostile attitudes toward the United States and its founding principles and who do not support the Constitution.
Perfect. So this was what occurred in January of 2017. And as we will see, this is nothing new. In fact, anti-immigrant movements have used hostility to the Constitution as a standard for identifying unwanted immigrants. So I'm going to share with you this next slide. So here I have just different things I'm going to talk about. The first one is in the 1840s, there was a group called the Know-Nothings. They opposed Irish immigration, which was based on the belief that Catholicism was incompatible with the Constitution. So as I mentioned before, this has been discussed in detail in the last presentation that I did. And so we won't be looking in depth at the Know-Nothings by any means. In 1882, Congress enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this was declaring that the Chinese people were too foreign to embrace constitutional principles. And then we have in 1924, Congress enacted the National Origins Act out of the belief that members of the so-called Nordic race alone were innately willing to embrace constitutional values, while Jews, Italians, Poles, and others should be excluded because they would destroy the nation's constitutional system. That policy continued until 1965, when Congress adopted the Immigration and Nationality Act, which declares that the people of any race or nationality are equally capable of embracing the nation's constitutional values. Okay, so let's talk about the nativist idea. Maka, can you read this for us?
Yeah, I can. This article tells the story of an idea. It is an old idea, an ugly idea, a discredited idea. It is a nativist idea. The idea that the United States Constitution was made only for some people, while others should be excluded from entering the country out of suspicion that their race or religion make them likely to harbor hostility to the nation's constitutional principles.
Thank you. And because this is an old idea, there actually have been different names for people who are included and excluded. So some of these names for those who were included would be called white or Anglo-Saxon, Nordic, European. Sometimes they were called real Americans or 100% Americans or just plain old Americans. Sometimes the people who were said to be unfit for the Constitution were called Negro or Irish or Chinese or Italian or Jewish or Hispanic or Muslim. Okay, so Katia, can you read this next slide for us?
Each time, the idea has been pretty much the same. The Constitution was not made for them, and they must be excluded out of suspicion that their presence in the United States would undermine the nation's Republican values.
Thank you. Okay, so when Americans tell themselves who they are, they usually say something along the lines of what Franklin Roosevelt said in 1943. So I'm not sure who else is online. I can't see. Can somebody
I'll
else
read,
read this? Thank you.
The principle on which this country was founded and by which it has always been governed is that Americanism is a matter of the mind and heart. Americanism is not, and never was, a matter of race or ancestry. A good American is one who is loyal to this country and to our creed of liberty and democracy.
Thank you. If you can keep reading the next one as well.
Conventional understanding. Roosevelt expressed what has become the conventional understanding of American nationalism, that what unites the nation and what makes America, America, is a shared devotion to a common creed of liberty, equality, and democracy, a creed expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In the conventional understanding, the American creed consists of a universal set of principles that can be embraced by anyone without regard to race, religion, or ancestry. And as Roosevelt claimed, American national identity has, quote unquote, always meant devotion to the American creed and has never been about race or ancestry.
Thank you. What we're going to see, though, in this article is that the nativist view has guided most of American policies. So we're going to read this last quote, and then I'm going to show you the timeline. Could somebody else read this last one?
For most of American history, the dominant view that has guided American policies has been the nativist belief that only people who share the nation's dominant ethnicity and religion are capable of constitutional devotion, while others must be excluded because of the dangers they are suspected to pose to the nation's fundamental values.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna begin with a line of history. So I'm gonna take this off now. Go to board. Okay. If I didn't get a chance to practice this, so I really hope that I write big enough yet small enough so I fit it all on this line. Okay, so we're going to start in 1751. Isn't that, it's going to bug me, 1 second. Okay. So in 1751, traditions of American nativism predate the establishment of the United States. So in this time period, Benjamin Franklin expressed his belief that immigration to the American colonies should be limited to the lovely white and should exclude all Blacks. So that's Benjamin Franklin. Okay, so this is even before America. Okay, independent. So then we have the next one I want to talk about is 1790. Okay, and this is the that's so big. Okay, the Naturalization Act. And this provided that naturalized citizenship could only be bestowed upon someone who was both a free white person and who swore to support the Constitution of the United States. So in linking these two traits, Congress effectively declared that only people of the dominant race were capable of forming an attachment to the nation's fundamental principles. These dual requirements for naturalized citizenship, commitment to constitutional principles, and membership in the white race persisted with relatively few changes until 1952. Okay. Then maybe I'll just put it up here. Then in 1840s, actually, and so in the 1840s, we have the Know Nothings. I'm gonna write it here because it's also. Okay, in the 1840s, we have the Know Nothings who opposed Irish immigration based on the belief that Catholicism was incompatible with the Constitution. And in 1856, the American Party, which was the official name. So this is when they got their official name in 1856. The Know Nothings believed that the Irish Catholics brought disease and stole American jobs, but even worse, Catholics would always be loyal to a foreign despot and could never embrace the principles of the American Constitution. Okay, so I don't know if I had this in my slides, but anyways, there was a track that the Know Nothings had printed, and the quote in there says, "The strange, cruel monster of Rome can never amalgamate with the beautiful form of America. Liberty and despotism are two eternal opposites." And so in order to protect the Constitution and the American way of life, the Know Nothings argued Catholics must be excluded from immigration and barred from positions of power. Okay, in 1876, no, in 1876, 1876, we have the Democrats. They denounced. Why is it so slinky? Denounced. Okay, they denounced the Mongolians. So the Democratic Party adopted a platform that denounced all Mongolian immigration. As the party's platform declared, such immigration should be barred because it amounted to the incursions of a race not sprung from the same great parent stock. and in fact now by law denied citizenship through naturalization. In particular, the Democrats charged Chinese were unsuitable to immigration because they could never participate in constitutional self-government. They were unaccustomed to the traditions of the progressive civilization, one exercised in liberty under equal laws. What I found interesting was it was actually the Democrats who started this idea, or the Republicans later on. Yeah, I can move this down now. So in 1882, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, but this is now from the Republicans. Okay. So the Republican Party soon adopted a similar policy, and in 1882, Congress enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act. It did so based on the widespread belief that the Chinese were simply incapable of participating in the nation's constitutional system. So here's what one senator said: "Free institutions are only possible with the favored races. It is not because they are a monopoly of the favored races, but because no other race is capable of creating them. No other race is capable of perpetuating them, and no other race is capable of treading freedom's heights with firm and unwavering steps." So when Congress enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, it declared that the Chinese people were too foreign to abide by the Constitution, and that only the white race could create and sustain a free government. And the government concluded that it would be destroyed by allowing immigration of other people who were incapable of participating in the American political system. So by the time the Great Nativist Movement began in 1894 and succeeded 30 years later in limiting immigration to persons of the so-called Nordic race, it had long been asserted that the Constitution was made solely for members of the nation's native racial stock, and others must be excluded as a threat to the Constitution and the American way of life. So it says it began in 1894. And it went for 30 years to 1924. So I'll just say 30 years. This is the Great Nativist Movement. I don't know if you can see the top of the whiteboard. Not really. There. Great Nativist. Okay, so in 1924, this was the nation's origin. Origin Act, which basically just says state white. Thanks. So the Nation's Origin Act was enacted by Congress, and this was based on the belief that protecting the Constitution requires maintaining the nation's original ethnic stock. This was based on the belief that members of the so-called Nordic race alone were innately willing to embrace constitutional values, while Jews, Italians, Poles, and others should be excluded because they would destroy the nation's constitutional system. When Congress adopted the National Origins Act in 1924, nativists declared that restricting immigration to people who shared the nation's ethnic, racial, or religious heritage was justified, not in spite of the nation's constitutional traditions, but in order to preserve them. And as history shows, beliefs in racial, religious, and ethnic supremacy have often been embedded in claims about what it means to embrace the Constitution. Okay, so what do I want to do next? So during the last quarter of the 19th century, immigration to the United States greatly increased. Not only did the number of immigrants and the percentage of foreign-born residents increase, the national origins of the immigrants also changed. So while most immigrants before 1860 had, was that me?
Sorry, you can continue.
Okay. So while most immigrants before 1860 had come from England, Ireland, and Germany, beginning in the 1880s, immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe increased, with millions of Italians, Russians, Greeks, Hungarians, and Poles arriving in the United States. And a majority of the new immigrants were Catholic and Jewish. Okay, I was going to write that on the board, but I don't think I will because I don't know how much space I'll have. So I'm going to leave that. And we're going to, I don't know where to do this. Maybe I'll do it over here. No, I think I'll just do it here, but then I'm going to have to erase it. So we're going to compare and contrast a bit. So many native-born Americans looked on the increase in immigration with alarm, believing that new immigrants brought crime, disease, poverty, and dangerously foreign ideas. There was widespread fear over the ability of the new immigrants to assimilate and participate in American public life. And so out of this, two popular movements arose that wanted to address the increase in immigration. On one hand, a movement arose to Americanize the immigrants by teaching them English and ingraining American values. On the other hand, a movement sought to stop immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe out of a belief that these immigrants were incapable of becoming good American citizens. Okay, so we have two popular movements. So one of them wants to Americanize. Okay, and the other one wants to just, I'm just going to say stop immigration completely, like. That is an M. Okay, so these are the two different movements, and these two competing national movements sought to address the problems associated with immigration. So the Americanization movement sought to transform immigrants into good citizens by educating them on American values, principally on the nation's civic values expressed in the Constitution. On the other hand, an immigration restriction movement sought to exclude unwanted immigrants based on the conviction that they could never embrace American values. Okay, so can somebody repeat to me the difference between these two movements? Anyone? I'm gonna actually change this. Can anybody hear me?
Sorry. Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
I got distracted, to be honest, but the second group wanted to exclude people from immigrating into the country altogether based off of their opinion, which was that they couldn't abide by their constitutional beliefs.
Thank you. Yes. So they wanted to stop immigration altogether. And this other group, though, wanted to, I'll just say, assimilate. Which just basically, they just wanted them to look and act American. So they were going to teach them how to do that. Whereas this group was just like, we don't even want them here. They're not able to do that. So both movements, though, they shared a common understanding that the American national identity is defined by commitment to a creed expressed in the Constitution. But where they differed, okay, so I should have done this. So how they compare is that how do I write this simply? Okay, the USA citizen has to have a commitment to the creed. Which is the Constitution. So that's how they both agree. Okay, a US citizen must have a commitment to the Constitution, the creed. But where they differ is that who can commit to the creed. So while the second group only believes that a true American can commit to the creed, this group believes that anyone can. So that's where they differ. So this is the contrast. So now I want to go into the first movement. So I'm going to draw a line that shows us kind of how this first movement came about. So I'm going to erase this now. Remember being that squeaky before. Okay, so let's start. So we're going to start in 1782. And these are letters from an American farmer. I'm just going to put letters. No, I'll just so okay. So in 1782, Hector St. John, he published his letters from an American farmer, which declared that in the United States, various nationalities were melting together to create a new nation. What then is the American, this new man? I could point out to you a family whose grandfather was an Englishman, whose wife was Dutch, whose son married a French woman, and whose present 4 sons have now 4 wives of different nations. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men. So although there's been no organized program that had developed over the 19th century to help new immigrants assimilate into the American ways, public school systems have always been devoted to fostering Republican values. So then we have 1898. 1898, and this is DAR. This is the Daughters of the American Revolution. And I'm going to put here the spirit of true Americanism. It's too big. Okay, so in 1898, the Daughters of the American Revolution launched a lecture series on American history and government, given in several foreign languages to teach immigrants the spirit of true Americanism. After beginning as a private movement, Americanization programs soon were offered by local and state governments. In the first decade of the 20th century, many cities with large immigrant populations, including New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Boston, began offering night classes for immigrants to learn English and civics. Okay, in 1907, we have New Jersey. New Jersey becomes the first state to have immigrant educational classes. So it becomes the first state to have classes. So this is the first state to support immigrant educational classes. A program followed the next year by New York, which declared that its goal was the making of new races into Americans. At the same time, states increased their efforts to Americanize immigrant children in public schools and began to mandate civic classes. The display of the American flag and daily, they had to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, so in schools. In 1908, there was a play. In 1908, there was a play, and this play helped with the melting pot metaphor. So the belief that immigrants would soon civilize was frequently expressed through the metaphor of the melting pot that had become part of the national vocabulary after the production of Israel Zangwill's play of that name in 1908. There are other patriotic societies like Sons of the American Revolution, which followed the Daughters here. They followed them, and also the YMCA as well. And they began offering evening classes for immigrants that combined English language instruction and lessons on American civics. Then by 1914, the YMCA, 1914, the YMCA had about 30,000 students. Sorry if this is small. Okay, so they had about 30,000 students. And also in 1914, Henry Ford began requiring foreign-born workers to attend Americanization classes at his factories, which, like other programs, combine language training and civics lessons. All right, so I'm gonna go back to Okay, can someone read this slide for me?
Melting pot. Into the pot, 52 nationalities with their foreign clothes and baggage to go, and out of the pod after a vigorous stirring by the teachers come one nationality. This by, I don't know how to say that, VIZ, American.
Okay, thank you. So on the 4th of July, Ford's program, there was a big graduation ceremony that was held. And it's actually the 4th of July is referred to as Americanization Day. So in this ceremony, immigrants wearing their native dresses would descend from a model boat into a large pot labeled melting pot. And the school teachers would stir this with a 10-foot ladle. The immigrants would then emerge from the pot wearing typical American clothes and waving the American flags. So World War I actually led to a rise in interest in Americanization programs. The military discovered that literacy was especially common among foreign-born draftees. And wartime also brought an increase in xenophobia, which increased pressure for the programs to encourage rapid assimilation. And the federal government did respond to these demands through the Bureau of Naturalization and Education. So this happened in 1916. So 1916. Don't know if I'm gonna have room for my other one. Okay. Bureau of Naturalization. Okay. So these agencies encouraged states to adopt Americanization programs and sought to coordinate state programs. And it was widely used in Americanization efforts. In 1920, this organization distributed nearly 100,000 textbooks. This is in 1920. What did I say, 100,000? Textbooks. Okay, so these textbooks were on citizenship to help immigrants assimilate as rapidly as possible and to protect American culture from foreign infiltration. In the midst of the post-war Red Scare, Americanization was seen as key to fighting communism. Oh, I can't see my board, really. Can someone else read this quote? Maka, could you read it if you can see it?
I'll read, yeah.
Thanks.
The immigration of recent years is largely composed of elements unfitted to absorb democratic ideas of government or to take part in the duties and responsibilities of citizenship under such a form government.
Okay, that's not the right one. Whoops.
Sorry, that's the one I can see. Sorry.
Sorry, maybe I didn't put it in like I was going to. Okay, I'll read it.
Is it the one under threat or is it a different one?
I'm not sure. Sorry. I'll read what I have because I don't.
Okay.
Okay. Although the Americanization movement sought to welcome rather than exclude foreigners, it should be recognized that it had a substantial nativist element in that it sought to eradicate foreign cultures from the midst of the United States. In seeking to persuade immigrants to give up their foreign ways, the Americanization movement nonetheless had an optimistic view of human nature, believing that all peoples, regardless of national origin, race, or religion, were capable of adopting American values and embracing the nation's constitutional principles. Maybe let me just stop share. 1 second. Yeah, I have it here, but it's out of order. My bad. All right, let's continue. So we're going to now look at the second movement, and I really will just do that. Okay, so I'm going to try to do a line again at the bottom here. And this is the Immigration Restriction League that was formed. And so we're going to start. So I guess I'll just put here too. This is the Americanization movement. This is the Americanization movement, and this is the Immigration Restriction League. And if you guys cannot see my board or my writing, let me know. So it's also known as the nope. Restriction. So this is known as the IRL. Okay, and so this will start in 1894. Sorry about that. So in 1894, 3 Harvard graduates, Charles, Robert, and Prescott Hall, formed the Immigration Restriction League. They declared that the group's purpose was to advocate for the exclusion of elements undesirable for citizenship or injurious to our national character. This is the one that Maka had just read, so we won't read it again. One IRL pamphlet declared in 1896 that the immigration of recent years is largely composed of elements unfitted to absorb democratic ideas of government or to take part in the duties and responsibilities of citizenship under such a form of government. So not only were the white immigrants unsuited to become good citizens, the IRL warned they brought over politically dangerous ideas, and their increasing presence threatened to undermine the American constitutional system. Okay, so that was in 1896. No, I haven't gotten there yet. Did I? Yeah, I did. Sorry. Okay, so in 1896, the first bill to create a literacy test. Okay, and this was the IRL was formed. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to my slides again. That's what I had. I didn't. Okay. What? Katia, can you give me permission to share? Maybe when you.
Share?
Yeah, I can't.
You can
Can't share
share?
my. No.
Did you co-host for both? Okay. Okay, try now, Tiffany.
Okay. Okay. So. This one. All right. So. Okay, Prescott Hall. This is one of the founders of the League, the IRL League. He recognized that many Americans believe that through the melting pot, the new immigrants could be Americanized. But he argued that the new immigrants could never assimilate because Americanization efforts could never significantly alter their characters. Somebody wants to read the quote that's on there. Go ahead and read that. Maybe Katia?
Yes, I can.
No,
Sorry. Prescott Hall. The new immigrants were simply incapable of becoming American. You cannot change the leopard spots, Hall declared, and you cannot change bad stock to good.
Thanks. Okay, so in 1896, Senator Henry Lodge, a longtime IRL supporter, introduced the first bill to create a literacy test. And Lodge made no effort to hide the fact that the purpose of this test was to exclude ethnicities and nationalities deemed too foreign to assimilate into American life. With the support of progressives and organized labor, the literacy bill passed both in the House of Congress, but President Cleveland vetoed it, rejecting the idea that limiting immigration to those who could read the Constitution would somehow protect the American way of life. Cleveland also rejected the argument that the recent immigrants were undesirable. The time is quite within recent memory, Cleveland's veto message explained, when the same thing was said of immigrants who, with their descendants, are now numbered among our best citizens. Although Congress was unable to override Cleveland's veto, so it didn't happen. So then in 1907, you guys aren't seeing my screen. Okay. 1907. Oops. 1907, you have the Dillingham Commission. And this went for 4 years. 4 years till 1911. And in the end, okay, let me just explain this first. So in 1907, Congress created a commission to study the immigration situation. And it's known as the Dillingham Commission after its chairman, the senator, his name was William Dillingham of Vermont. He was a longtime supporter of the IRL and several other immigration restrictionists as well. Its conclusions, issued in a 42 volume over 4 years that backed by lengthy data, set the stage for decades of debate over immigration restrictions. So by the end of this commission, there were 42 volumes worth of data. But it was obviously a big, there's been debates even till today. So with the backing of the Dillingham Commission, Congress renewed its push for a literacy test. And so in 1912, Congress once again passed a literacy test. So this was in 1912. Okay, yes. Literacy test. Another bill was passed. Okay, so, and finally, in February of 1917, this literacy test was enacted over President Wilson's veto. My notes. So in 1917, it was enacted. The test. To the disappointment of immigration restrictionists, the adoption of the literacy test did little to restrict the flow of large numbers of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, because in the 1896 time period when it was first introduced, literacy had increased up until this point. So in 1917, more people were able to read and write. So requiring immigrants to demonstrate an ability to read, the Constitution failed to keep out members of undesirable races as its supporters had hoped. So then in 1920, money actually stopped. Okay, stopped to support the Americanization. So because of this, basically how I understand it is this commission with the data was showing that this wasn't working. Well, it's debatable, but it was saying it wasn't working. And so money kind of stopped to help assimilate. And then in 1921, you have the Emergency Quota Act. Okay, with Representative Johnson's support, Congress acted to protect the nation's traditional ethnic mix by enacting what was termed an emergency measure to restrict immigration. The Emergency Quota Act restricted annual immigration to 3% of the number of foreign-born persons of each nationality present in the nation. So this leads us to the big one, which is in 1924, you have the, did I put this up there? Oh yeah, we have it up here. So the National Origins Act. So as you can see, like there were kind of two things happening here, but you can see what led to this act. So in 1924, Congress enacted the National Origins Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. For decades leading up to the passage of this act, the United States was divided over the ability of immigrants to embrace American values, especially those values embodied in the Constitution. On one side, the Americanization movement sought to help make the immigrants into good Americans through educational programs, which focused on teaching civics and ingraining respect for the American creed. But on the other side, an immigration restriction movement argued that only people who share the racial background of prototypical Americans had the temperament and capacity to embrace America's constitutional values, and all others should be excluded. And so by enacting this, in adopting the National Origins Act, Congress made nativism the nation's official policy, right? So okay, as its proponents hoped, the law succeeded in greatly reducing immigrants they deemed undesirable. So before the passage of this act, around 200 immigrants had arrived from Italy each year. But beginning in 1924, the annual quota for immigrants from Italy was set at less than 4,000 per year. And in Russia and Poland, which together had sent hundreds of thousands of immigrants to the United States, were allotted slightly less than 10,000 per year. So as you can see, this definitely changed the amount of immigrants that were entering the country. But in 1952, so I'm going to put it up here because then in 1952 is when it was finally, the racial criteria was repealed. And then you have this major 1965. This is when you have the Immigration and Nationality Act. That says nationality. Okay. So in 1965, this is at the height of civil rights movement. Congress repudiated as an American the racism and nativism that animated the National Origins Act and declared that persons of any race, religion, or national origin were equally capable of embracing the nation's constitutional ideals. Every president elected since 1965, with the possible exception of Donald Trump, has declared adherence to the now orthodox view that anyone can become an American by embracing the national's constitutional ideals. Despite this orthodoxy, white nationalists and others have kept alive the belief at heart that United States is really a white European Christian nation and that its constitutional values can only be claimed by members of that cohort. They look on 1965 as the year that America betrayed its heritage by opening the floodgates to immigrants from Latin America and Asia, whose presence undermines American values. Today, Muslims are a principal target of anti-immigrant activists who declare that Islam is incompatible with the Constitution. So, we're going to now look at our time period, what's happened more recently. So, this is going to be talking a little bit about, and then we're going to close. This is going to be talking about Donald Trump and how the return of nativism returned to the White House. In 2016, the United States elected the first president in decades who embraced bluntly nativist views and who made clear he intended to implement a nativist agenda. Throughout his presidency, Obama was dogged by the Tea Party movement, which used familiar nativist rhetoric to label the president and his allies as un-American, as dangerously foreign, and as enemies of the Constitution. Okay, so. What am I doing here? Sorry. One second. Okay. Somebody want to read this quote?
Obama and the Tea Party movement shared belief that the principles found in the Constitution embody the defining American values, but the Tea Party asserted that Obama and his allies were actively seeking to undermine the Constitution and destroy America. The Tea Party movement identified the forces it opposed as foreign and identified as its goal the restoration of authentic American values and real Americans whose power allegedly had been wrongly usurped.
Thank you, Annabelle. The Tea Party's central target. I'm hearing an echo. The Tea Party's central. Is that unmuted? The Tea Party's central target was President Obama, who was routinely depicted as fundamentally foreign. He was sometimes described as foreign by birth by so-called birthers who claimed that he was not born in the United States and therefore was constitutionally ineligible to be president. He was sometimes described as religiously foreign by those who believed he was secretly a Muslim living in a Christian nation. And he was sometimes described as racially foreign by those who envision the United States as a white nation. And Donald Trump came to the attention of the Tea Party supporters in March of 2011 as a proponent of birthism, Trump repeatedly claimed that Obama was not born in the United States, that Kenya was his true homeland, and that he might be Muslim, and that he faked his birth certificate, and that he was not legitimately president. The birther charge arises out of a nativist suspicion that the president was of foreign birth and therefore was constitutionally unfit for office. Okay, no. I think I totally missed that one. Okay, so if somebody would like to read this next quote, that would be good.
When he ran for president in 2016, Trump's presidential campaign was built on the same nativist themes that animated the birther movement. His central campaign promises, building a wall on the Mexican border and barring Muslim immigration, invoked nativism by playing off fears of foreign infiltration and the need to exclude dangerous foreigners.
Right. And Trump also surrounded himself with advisors with long histories in nativism. Steve Bannon, Trump's campaign manager and later a senior White House advisor, was the editor-in-chief of the Breitbart News, which Bannon described as the platform for the alt-right. Breitbart has explained that what it calls the alt-right, and which most others call white nationalism, derives from the thinking of Sam Francis and the Patrick Buchanan presidential campaigns, among other sources. And Trump's nativist appeals were enthusiastically cheered by the conservative press. So there's actually a lady who, this is the next one, I don't, who wrote a book. And it's called In Trump We Trust. She praises him for recognizing that America's constitutional identity is only possible because of its ethnic core. Within days of taking office, Trump signaled his intent to implement a nativist agenda that relies on the conviction that Muslims should be barred from immigration because their religion makes them likely to be hostile to the Constitution. And in his first week in office, Trump signed an executive order that bars entry into the country from citizens of 7 predominantly Muslim countries. And the attacks of September 11, 2001, President George Bush spoke at the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C., and tried to make it clear to the American public that the United States was not at war with Islam and that Islam was not to blame for the attacks. Victoria, could you read this next one for me?
Sure. George Bush, these acts of violence against innocents violate the fundamental tenets of the Islamic faith. And it's important for my fellow Americans to understand that the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. These terrorists don't represent peace. They represent evil and war. When we think of Islam, we think of a faith that brings comfort to 1 billion people around the world. Billions of people find comfort and solace and peace. And that's made brothers and sisters out of every race,
Thank you. In the last 10 years, however, a group of anti-Muslim activists who bill themselves as experts on Islam have tried to show that Bush was wrong and that Islam is dedicated to violence and global domination. With the election of President Trump, the belief that Islam threatens constitutional values has moved from the margins into the White House. Okay, so this next one. Bannon. So Trump's senior White House advisors, including Steve Bannon, who had mocked President Bush's suggestion that Islam is a religion of peace. Islam is not a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of submission. Bannon believes that Islam and Christianity are engaged in a global war, and Muslims are temperamentally opposed to democratic values. So the executive order on immigration is but one illustration of Trump administration policies that link constitutional values with traits of prototypical Americans. So in August of 2017, President Trump expressed support for a proposal that would reduce by half the number of legal immigrants by restricting visas for family reunification, a policy that primarily benefits immigrants from Latin America and Asia, and which would instead give visas primarily to skilled workers, especially those who can demonstrate proficiency in English. The proposal rejects the key policy that animates the 1965 Immigration Act, that anyone of any race, nationality, or religion is equally capable of becoming a valued part of the American nation, and would limit immigration to persons who have demonstrated an ability to assimilate, which could be shown by an ability to speak English. As President Trump has explained, immigration should be restricted to those who share our values and love our people. It is a necessary step, he has said, to protect real Americans who have been edged out of their rightful place. We're going to take back our country, folks, he declared. We're going to take our country back. So, if someone can just read this last slide for me. Just so that anyone.
What the history explored in this article should show is that constitutional nationalism, the belief that being American means believing in a common creed embodied in the Constitution, has not always been a benign and universalistic force. Devotion to the Constitution may be the cement that unites Americans, but it has also repeatedly been invoked to justify excluding unwanted people who by race, religion, or national origin do not share the traits of native-born Americans.
Tiffany, you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Okay, so I just want to kind of explain again what we were looking at. So we were looking at different events throughout history that shows us that what's happening today is nothing new, rather in when Trump was president, and that he wasn't doing anything new. I remember the first time when I heard about the wall, I didn't think it was real. Like, I thought that was a joke. Like, I didn't realize that it was actually a real thing. I guess because I just couldn't imagine that people would think that way, you know? So going over this history is really helpful because it allows us to see that this type of thought process was around for a long time. And so to want people to not come into the country or to be a certain way is shown through these two movements. And like I said before, the similarity of them is that they believe that you have to adhere to the Constitution, and that's how they agree. Like, you must be a certain way. But how they differ is that one of them wants to assimilate you, educate you, teach you how to be an American, and the other one is just trying to stop you from even getting into the country. And then, as I said at the very end, we looked at some things that were happening while Trump was president, and he was just showing that he was supporting nativist ideas. I'm going to close here. If there are any questions, we can have a discussion at this point. Or do I pray and then we discuss? I don't know how it goes.
Jonathan, we can have the discussion.
Okay, sure. Is anything not clear? I don't know. Sorry, the board's not even, can't even see everything. But I really highly suggest that you just read the article for yourself. There's really a lot in there, and it was just really informative, really helpful.
Tiffany, 4 comments came to mind sort of just as you were presenting. An excellent presentation. First one is, it always strikes me as so ironic in a sense, and it's not anything new that we haven't heard, but everyone who comes to North America comes from somewhere other than the indigenous people who are originally here. And even they, you know, a lot of the movement across, you know, Asia, wherever and stuff, you know, there was migration of peoples in a sense over all time. But everybody was an immigrant. At some point they had parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who came to the new world from somewhere. And that often, much as it, yes, we're aware that that's the truth, but it gets ignored by those who want to ignore it. Second thought, just in reference to what you were just sharing just at the end there. For supremacy of one group over another to exist, there has to be one group that has a mindset bent on that. Because when you just think of what I just said a moment back, that everybody came from somewhere other than the indigenous people. So people were coming from all sorts of different European, Asian, you know, Middle Eastern, etc. countries. And somebody's got to decide, you know, bringing up the third point, that the Immigration Restriction League Act, you know, they were bent on restricting immigration. And it comes down to who decides who's in and who's out. Well, somebody decides. And obviously it's the people bent on that kind of mindset. And I mean, nowadays we could call it white supremacist, whatever way we wanted to label it. But, and other groups didn't have that mindset, because the people who came from Italy or from Russia or from, wherever, didn't make themselves supreme. It was in many cases, the ones from the quote unquote Caucasian countries, the particularly England, and on it goes. And it's just interesting how thinking evolves, and how there is nothing new under the sun in many ways. The last point was exactly what you were just saying, how it brings it up to today, not just during Trump's thing, but this literacy bill that you've made mention of. Have to be able to read the Constitution, reading and writing. The suppression of the vote has been contingent on a lot of these, not exactly the same, but similarly based. You close down a lot of the voting areas, you redistribute the voting districts, you make them have to sign or fill in a form, where reading and writing obviously are required. On and on and on, all the different things that have been put in place in various states over the last probably 2 years. And again, it does hearken to all the way from whatever your first date was, I've forgotten, 1750, something, 51, all the way through to today. People haven't changed. The same mindset is there. This Americanism, the real American, make America great. And it's, well, in many ways it's obnoxious, because it's absolutely contrary to a message of equality, genuine equality, and what God stands for. Anyway, thank you, Tiffany. That was very good.
If there's no other thoughts or questions, I'm going to just close. All right. So you can hear me. Let's just pray. God of heaven, thank you so much for having us showing us through history that there is nothing to be surprised about, that history really does show us a lot, Lord. And we pray that you would help us to understand the time in which we live. Help us to be lights in this dark world to those around us. May we show that you are in our lives by our actions, our words, our demeanor. And we thank you, Lord, for the work that you're doing, not only in us, but in this whole world, that you are reaching hearts, and that you're coming as soon. And we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. God bless everyone.